When I was younger, I used to think the X-Men films had a pretty straightforward timeline. You had the original trilogy in the early 2000s. X-Men leads into X-Men 2, which leads to the next film, which leads to The Last Stand. And then we had X-Men Origins Wolverine, which tells the origins of specific characters. Simple enough, even when things got a little weird. But then the new movies start to come, and then you go back and start looking at the details, and things get a little confusing. They start to contradict each other in ways that felt almost unintentional, like the movies were being rewritten as they went, with no one really fully committing to any singular idea. Take a look at Saber-tooth, for example. He's basically Magneto's silent enforcer. He has zero personality, he barely speaks, and there's no hint whatsoever that he has any real history with Wolverine beyond just being another mutant he's fighting. But then X-Men Origins Wolverine comes along and completely reimagines him as Logan's half-brother, someone he fought alongside for a century through wars and as a part of Team X. It's not framed as a big reveal, the movie just drops it in as if it was always the truth. At the end of Origins, Logan gets shot in the head with an adamantium bullet and loses almost all his memories. That could explain why he doesn't recognize Saber-tooth in the first film, but here's the part that makes it really strange. Saber-tooth walks away from that island with his memories fully intact. He's not the one who got his brain wiped. So why, 20 years later, does he treat Wolverine like some random mutant he's never met before? And those are the kind of contradictions that don't stay isolated. The version of Wade Wilson in Origins is barely even the same guy as the one in the Deadpool movie. Of course, there's the obvious fact that both their origins are radically different from each other. Deadpool in the Fox movie seemingly has no kind of history with Logan, while in Origins Wolverine, they were on the same squad at one point in history. Then by the end of Origins Wolverine, he's turned into this silent, mouth-sewn weapon with random powers.
Stryker finally figured out how to shut you up.
What's wild is that Fox did not originally plan just to throw this version away. Back in the day, they were developing an X-Force movie with Jeff Wadlow, who would have kept this exact version of Deadpool alive and tried to evolve him, turning him into a mercenary with a makeshift suit, inching closer to the comic version people actually wanted. If that happened, the timeline would have been more confusing, considering that Deadpool in the 2016 film would have had a completely different kind of origin. It's a question though if the 2016 film would have ever been greenlit. But then Deadpool 2 does something even stranger. It does not just ignore Origins, it directly interacts with it. In the post-credit scene, our Deadpool travels back in time and kills that version from Origins Wolverine. It's played purely for laughs, but sit with the implications for a second. If that version was somehow a part of the same continuity, then Deadpool just murdered a past version of himself in a way that would create a paradox. But it doesn't. So what exactly got erased? A previous iteration or some alternate Wade Wilson that was floating around in the timeline for no reason, which does kind of make the whole time travel aspect nonsensical. Tell me this. If Deadpool was in the first X-Men movie and traveled back in time to X-Men Origins Wolverine and followed Saber-tooth around, would he transform into the one seen in the first X-Men movie, or would he just disappear, meaning that the Saber-tooth in the first X-Men movie is not the same one as in Origins Wolverine? Though I do realize that this was meant to be a meta joke, so it shouldn't really be taken very seriously, but it is still relevant, as this was an encapsulation of the loose style of the Fox X-Men continuity. That's the thing with the Deadpool movies in general. Characters sometimes feel like they have entirely new origins. The Colossus in the Deadpool films is bigger, more muscular, and has a thick Russian accent compared to his quieter American accented version from the original trilogy. It's never really explained or delved into on screen why these changes happen. Fox simply never enforced a tight continuity across the franchise. Different directors wanted different tones, so they recast and soft rebooted elements as needed without bothering to connect the dots. And then there's the aging, which has its own special kind of weird. In First Class, Charles and Magneto are young men in 1962. By Apocalypse in 1983, 20 plus years later, they look almost identical. Another decade to Dark Phoenix in 1992, and yet again, barely any visible change. Yet the prequels are meant to eventually lead into the original trilogy, set around 2000 to 2006, where the same characters are suddenly played by much older actors. So they barely age in the 30 in-universe years, and then rapidly age decades in less than a decade of story time. It's never explained and never really acknowledged within the plot. And then there's the whole issue with Charles Xavier walking and using his powers at the same time. In First Class, after he gets shot and paralyzed, the rule is clear. He can only walk if he takes a serum, but the serum completely suppresses his telepathic power. Yet in X-Men Origins Wolverine, we see him walking and actively using his powers to rescue mutants. And in X-Men The Last Stand, he's walking around while talking telepathically. It's one of the cleanest and most undeniable contradictions in the entire franchise. In X-Men The Last Stand, there's a brief moment in the Danger Room where the X-Men are training against what looks like Sentinels. It's not a major plot point, but it suggests that the team is already familiar with them as a threat by around 2006. But then Days of Future Past comes along and treats the entire Sentinel program like it's being invented in the 1970s, with a dystopian future hinging on those events. So now you're left wondering, were Sentinels already a thing in the original timeline? And if they were, and the X-Men were already aware of their existence, it's kind of strange how they're not made out to be a bigger deal, and their presence in the movies prior to Days of Future Past aren't really delved into. And then Logan breaks it all over again. It's set in 2029, just a handful of years after the optimistic 2023 ending we see in Days of Future Past. At the end of Days of Future Past, the dark future gets overwritten into a hopeful one, but Logan doesn't feel like a continuation of that revised timeline at all. Instead, we get a bleak world where no new mutants have been born in years. Most of the X-Men are dead or gone, and the species is quietly going extinct. Days of Future Past was all about preventing the extinction of mutants, and yet in Logan, set in that very same timeline, mutant kind is still dying out, just slower and sadder this time. The big heroic reset ultimately feels kind of meaningless. And just when you think the Fox timeline couldn't get even more tangled, the MCU steps in and makes it even stranger.